Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is the 7th session of the Evolution of the Arts in a Digital World Symposium. I'm Alison Kenny-Gardhouse, Vice President of Music and Engagement at the Francis Winspear Center for Music and the Edmonton Symphony Orchestra. It's great to see all of you online, and a warm welcome to everyone from coast to coast in Canada, coast to coast in Canada, and south of the border in the United States. We'd like to give a shout out to Canada Council and the Arts Digital Strategy Fund. This funding has made it possible for us to be able to offer these sessions to everybody without charge. So thank you, Canada Council. If you would feel inclined to make a donation to help support the symposium costs, we would be very appreciative of that. And there is a donation page that is placed in chat should you want to do that. And thank you for your support. We also would like to thank ARUP for their support. So let's get started with immersive versus interactive technology, a practical guide. For today's session, we have 4 panelists who are here to provide advice, recommend specific technologies, and discuss the changing fields of immersive and interactive technology. I'd like to welcome to the virtual stage, Jessie Moffat, Director of Collections and Exhibitions at the National Music Centre in Calgary, Amanda Dirksen, Digital Initiatives Librarian at the Edmonton Public Library, Dan Alfano, the Manager of Digital Initiatives at the Edmonton Public Library, and Milan Krapelka, Senior Manager of Exhibit Design and Quality at the TELUS World of Science, Edmonton. So if you check the chat, you'll see a brief biography for each of our panelists. I'm going to ask our panelists a series of questions, and each panelist will have about 3 minutes to respond to each question. We'll have a question and answer period near the end of the presentation. So please put any questions you have for our panelists in the chat, and we will address them then. And any comments, any thoughts as we go along, just pop them into chat so that we can see what you're thinking about. So our first question, how would your organization define the difference between immersive and interactive technology? We're going to start off with Jessie. And Jessie, you're at the National Music Centre in Calgary. So what would your organization define the difference between immersive and interactive technology as?
Well, thanks for inviting us. At Studio Bell, which is our facility, home of the National Music Centre, throughout our 22 exhibition spaces, we use a combination of real-life objects and props to create context and atmosphere. Then technology's role is to amplify and intensify the experience. We're not an organization that has ventured into the augmented reality or virtual reality worlds at this point, often associated with immersive technologies by definition. But as an object-based cultural collecting institution, or what we define as a museum, we primarily showcase physical objects, then use technology to assist in creating the environment and storytelling by creating active or passive engagement opportunities. So I view both immersive and interactive technologies as tools to create the environment and amplify the stories we're trying to tell. When we create what I call bricks and mortar, so that's within our physical buildings, exhibitions, we try to utilize technology to create engaging and interesting access points. So for online experiences, we use interactive technologies for visitors to engage with our content. Online visitors are encouraged to explore collections, stories, videos, oral histories, concerts, and education programs at their leisure through one of 2 platforms, our Collections Online platform or our Amplify publishing platform, which is recently going to be updated, and I think it launches again in the next week or so. So over the next few years, I strongly believe that you'll see more and more museums, including the National Music Centre, invest in emergent technologies like AR, VR to engage visitors with our content in new and exciting ways. ultimately, in the end, the more points of access you have using technology to amplify your content, the more engagement it will result.
Great, thank you, Jesse. I'm going to throw the question to Dan from the Edmonton Public Library. How would your organization define the difference between immersive and interactive technology? Over to you, Dan.
Thanks, Allison, and good morning, everybody. Yeah, it's a really interesting question, the difference between immersive and interactive technology. I'd say that immersive technology will transport you, and it takes you to another place. Your surroundings, everything that technology does transports you to another place, and it makes you feel in a completely different world. And interactivity, to me, is a bit of a scale. So you could have something that is highly interactive, pushing buttons, jumping, moving, seeing, smelling, whatever you need to do to make that experience better. Or it can be really simple. It can be simply using your eyes and ears, or being sort of a slightly more passive participant in that interactivity. But as long as it captures your attention, then it is an interactive exhibit. So that's kind of a scale for me. And I guess an example of that that kind of grand scale of immersion, if you were to be completely immersed, would be kind of the Disney model, or the model you might see at some of the large theme parks around the world, where every single thing immerses you in that experience. And it's not just the TV screens and the technology, it's the light switches and the carpet and the paint on the walls that transports you to that place. So within the context of the library, I mean, we're kind of relatively new to exhibits, but we're putting some thought and concerted effort towards, I guess, creating interactive experiences that make sense within the context of our branches and provide a unique experience to our customers. You know, we didn't get too long to share it with our customers, but we've got a really giant digital wall in our Stanley A. Milner branch that just opened up in September, and that is truly an immersive experience. It makes our lobby feel like you are walking around with dinosaurs or swimming in the coral reef. And I hope one day we can invite you all back and to come see it, and you can kind of get an example of what that might look like. But in the end, I'd say it doesn't always have to be super high tech. To be immersive and interactive, you can use minimal tech and still have an effective result.
Terrific. Thanks, Dan. I'm going to pose the question then again to Milan from TELUS Science Center here in Edmonton. Milan, how would your organization define the difference between immersive and interactive technology?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Again, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. Great answers so far from Jesse and Dan. I think I echo Dan's thing about immersive being a transformative, transporting energy. You know, for us, TELUS Photo Science, we have a feature exhibit gallery within which we host exhibits from around the world, 10,000 square feet of that. And so we get to see a great deal of variety when it comes to ways to immerse audiences and interact with audiences. And traditionally, that's been defined sort of as set dressing, and if you will, as Dan talks about, you know, your entire environment literally being something you can engage with. What we see now is our audience is getting a bit more savvy, by which I mean they get bored more easily, and we find the need to engage them sort of in a more comprehensive way. For us, that means, you know, normally you have an exhibit that has a message and you push a button and something happens. And so you're part of a predetermined series of events. And that's how you interact. You push a button, something happens. You move a lever, something happens. What we're seeing now, though, is a trend towards engaging people in a more comprehensive, as I mentioned, way, which allows them to be immersed sort of emotionally and mentally. So they get a question or a challenge or some sort of fact, and they're posed a problem that they have to solve with tools. So it's their actual involvement, they drive the outcome as opposed to us determining the outcome. They push a button, something happens. Now they drive the outcome. So it's a user-driven outcome thing, which I think engages them much more thoroughly and makes them feel immersed, even if the environment hasn't been set dressed. And so I think one's a subset of the other. We're just finding a shift in the way that we operate in most galleries to try to get people to be involved so heavily that they feel immersed with our environment and with the interaction.
Great. Thank you so much, Milan.
Sure.
And over to Amanda. You're also with the Edmonton Public Library, but perhaps you have a different focus. How would your organization define the difference between immersive and interactive technology?
Hey, I agree with pretty much everything that was said. One of the things that we talked about a lot when we were putting together our giant, great big wall were definitions. So we had librarians and developers sometimes talking at cross purposes, trying to figure out if we were speaking the same language and what was going on and what did we mean by this and that, what was interactivity. But one of the things that we actually didn't debate or argue about at all was immersive. And we decided that immersive needed to be one of the key things that we were looking for in everything to do with the wall. Anything that we put on it has to be immersive in some way. And what we boiled that down to was when you are near it or you step up to it, you are emotionally placed within that experience. You're connected, you're involved, you feel yourself in that place, and that's what you're focusing on. And we have an advantage with the wall in that it's enormous, and when you step close to it, it's difficult not to feel transported in some way. But then you also need to look at sound, the quality of the visuals. So you can't just put up, a PowerPoint and call it immersive, even though it's on a giant screen. That's not enough. It has to have those other components as well. So looking for that emotional connection for that immersion is, I think, really key.
That's great. I'm just noticing Amanda saying that she loves the idea of a user-driven outcome, which is much more immersive and engaging. And Milan spoke to that. And Amanda, I think I'm hearing that from you as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Interesting, the conversation across your organization initially with the librarians, for example, and how every part of every organization, people come with a different perspective, and how important it must have been for you to have those initial conversations as the digital wall was being conceived. So good work on that. And do you feel like the librarians at the end of the discussion and the final creation of that digital wall felt heard?
Yes, I think so. I was often the librarian in the room, so I hope I've represented my colleagues all right on that front. Part of it too was, it's an organization full of librarians, so sometimes IT developers feel a little, they're an island. They're surrounded by librarians at all times. So our voices are often the stronger ones, for better or for worse. So making sure that we were on the same page and they felt heard as well was really important.
Yeah, so maybe the question is whether Dan felt heard as a developer or not, but we can leave that. We're going to move on. Our next question, actually, Dan, you're going to be the first one to tackle it. Where do you recommend organizations begin when they're planning to include immersive or interactive technology in their organization's daily activities? Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, so assuming that your organization has gotten to a place where maybe you've received some sort of funding or a capital project has been approved, and you now have this lump sum of funding to create an immersive experience or an interactive experience for your guests, customers, whichever word you like to use. I think typically you can have an idea and then seek out that grant, or sometimes the grants exist and you might want to pursue it. I think that's a really good place to start, is where you're getting your funding. Let's assume you have that figured out and you have a budget to work within. I think then you take a look at where is that best placed within your facility, and what would be most successful and most, I guess, widely used by your visitors. Is there a captive audience somewhere? Do you have a queue or a lineup area? Is there a lobby that You know, maybe a family member goes up and to purchase tickets and the rest of the family stays back and is playing around with an exhibit. What is that location? What kind of floor space do you have? And really, then I think, at least in my opinion, then I think you can go to say, okay, what kind of interesting technology can we use? Here's the confines of our space. I'm going to assume that you have some sort of subject matter that you'll be focusing on, and have some sort of general direction. But I think funding, where is it actually going to go? And what is your topic? And then from there, maybe you can start narrowing the ideas down as, is it something that you want people to be active? Is it something that people are jumping and running and shouting and singing? How is that going to impact the rest of your space and your experience in the location of that exhibit? So thinking about what the impact of putting that in that place will have on the rest of your facility as well. I'll maybe save some time for others to pitch in too, but those are kind of the first steps that I would take. And I do have a lesson learned in that. I worked in a place where we had this really cool classroom on the floor of our museum, our science center space. And we wanted to do lots of really fun work with people, soldering, delicate work and things like that. And right next to it was this very cool, super noisy bing bong ball machine. Those two didn't go work very well together when you're trying to deliver a class, but there's this also really cool kinetic sculpture next to it. Independently, they're both amazing things. Right next to one another, they don't really work so well. So keeping in mind the context of your exhibits is really important too.
Great, thanks Dan for sharing that. The things that you learned on the job didn't perhaps anticipate initially. So I'm going to pass that question over to Milan. Where do you recommend organizations begin when they're planning to include immersive or interactive technology in their daily activities? Milan.
Yeah, thank you, Allison. Yeah, Dan, the ball machine he's talking about at the Science Center, rebuilt that thing twice in my life already, and it is quite amazing. But it doesn't, it makes you think about adjacencies. We thought when we were planning that gallery that it'd be cool to keep the space active and hyper. But as Dan pointed out, having it next to a more quiet learning space is not a good idea. And so we have to learn that lesson ourselves. But to be on point to the question, Dan also alluded to kind of focusing resources. And I think that's a great direction to go. For me, I would suggest you start small and simple. So for us, it's been a slow and steady process to move to this user-driven outcome I mentioned earlier. We didn't just jump in with both feet. Some places in Canada or around North America tried that. They renovated their entire facilities and went straight for a user-driven outcome. But I found that challenging. Guests don't want to facilitate and participate at the same time. They're not trained to do that when they come in, right? They need to know what is the point of what they're doing, what's the so what of what they're doing. And so I find it's important to stay focused and stay small when you start. And like Dan said, find the place in your facility that can most benefit from some sort of enhancement and work on that. And we have a saying in our facility, or at least in my department, that if you fail early, you fail cheap. And failing's part of it, right? Failing's part of the discovery process. We appreciate failures. We fail much more than we succeed. We try to fail as early as possible and as cheaply as possible. I don't want to imply that there isn't a great deal of knowledge and competence in the industries. Of course there is. But I'm talking more about the audience and the way they behave and how you can't really predict that. And it's different facilities, different energies. So when you come to the Science Center, you have a different energy when you come to the museum. And a museum audience, they have a very different intent when they enter the facility as opposed to a Science Center or a library perhaps. And so knowing what your audience is, the same people, right? Like even the same day even. So knowing your audience is really important. And I think starting small to get to know how they react to the messages you're proposing will help you manage resources, manage technology, and keep it sort of at the service of the experience. So I think start small.
Thank you, Milan. And I just love that fail early, fail cheap. Yeah. And I think, of course, all of us with nonprofits, we don't have endless budgets. So that makes a whole lot of very practical sense. And it also makes me think of one of our taglines at the WinSpear, some of the things we've worked with, radical experiments, small experiments with radical intent. So sometimes trying out the small things and learning, moving on. And part of that learning can be, of course, from the things that fail as well as the things that work. I'm going to pass that question over to Amanda. So Amanda, what do you recommend, where do you recommend organizations begin when they're planning to include immersive or interactive technology in their daily activities?
I would strongly recommend starting with your story or your user's story, figuring out what the community needs or desires and working from there. I think it's really easy to fall into the trap of, this technology is very slick and cool and we want it, or we've been given a grant to purchase technology. So we're going to do that first and then figure out what we're going to do with it afterwards. And I've been blessed or cursed in my career to be in situations where maybe the technology is plentiful, but that user-driven experience maybe hasn't quite been gotten to yet. So if you have a room full of 3D printers because you had money to purchase them, suddenly it's what's your service plan? Will people actually use them? How do they use them? We have it's an EDM touch table at our Millwoods branch, which was purchased with a grant. And it started its life as a sort of game machine. So we had purchased games from app stores and put them on the table. And it wasn't very well used. People would usually walk by it. They didn't spend a lot of time with it. So obviously that's not a successful application of that grant money. When I did an environmental scan of other libraries that had purchased tables, it was a lot of librarians reflecting on how they weren't quite sure what to do with the table. And the one successful example was a library that had a very strong sense of, we have a collection that we've digitized and we want to showcase it. That is what the table is for. And then they were very happy with that experience. So we sort of reworked our table to be a community experience.
And can you, for my benefit, what you said an IDM table?
IDM is a brand. So it's essentially an overgrown iPad. It's a giant 65-inch multi-touch table, 80 touch points, so you can have lots of people interacting with it simultaneously. So it's meant to be like a group experience. You go up, you discover something, you're shoulder to shoulder in a pre-pandemic or post-pandemic world with strangers or friends, and you're all interacting with it simultaneously.
Thank you for sharing that. And again, always the things that you learn. So that same table now, which library was it in? The first one?
The Millwoods branch is south.
How did the use of that morph?
We started working with post-secondary students. So we would go into the classroom as a community client so they can learn how the development process works when there is a client that they need to work with. So I would come in with sort of the parameters of the table, the things that we need them to hit when they're developing. And at the end, there were usually a handful of games that had sort of hit that level required to be playable on the table. So then we can put them on the table and we have a showcase of student work, and they can say, hey, I made something and it's out there in public and people are using it. And we saw a lot more use that way. We saw students being excited about it. And I'm quite sad that we can't currently run it with pandemic restrictions, but I'm very hopeful that we'll get back to it.
Great, thank you very much, Amanda. All right, moving on to the next question. And it is, if you could provide one piece of advice about integrating technology of any kind in a nonprofit organization, what would it be? Let's start with Milan on that. So Milan, if you could provide one piece of advice about integrating technology of any kind in a nonprofit organization, what would it be?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. And I think in echo of me saying earlier to start small and also to relate back to some things that Amanda has talked about. It's very easy to be seduced by technology, right? Technology is wonderful, and it sort of reminds me of VR. Like VR is the next big thing, and it has been for 30 years. Like, I mean, everybody wants to do VR, and it's coming, but there are hygiene issues, there are barriers of interface, there are barriers of other kinds that people face. And so starting small and sequentially is really important, but it's not easy. And I appreciate this, especially, the smaller that your budgets are, the more likely it is that they come from things that are outside your control, so other stakeholders, which comes with pressure, the grant development stuff. We found $10,000 for something, let's go make something amazing. And it has to include this kind of TV. I'm like, okay, well, that's great. I can think of something because this is what we do for a living. But the danger there is what we refer to as scope creep in our industry. And that is that you try to tell too much with too small of an interaction. So you have one opportunity to engage a visitor, and you think, okay, well, I'm going to use technology to make every story available to them, right? They can learn about gravity, they can learn about space, they can learn about rockets, they can learn about all these things. And in the end, I feel that means they learn about very few of those things. I prefer to try to teach or try to help people experience, fewer things that are higher quality as opposed to more things that are lower quality. Now, that's in an ideal world. As I mentioned before, we have other stakeholders that are paying our bills, and they want results. And so it's a bit of re-education as to what does it mean to get results, right? It doesn't mean it doesn't mean a whole bunch of things. It could mean something very transformative could be focused on and allow you to really deliver your message with technology. And so I think when it comes to integrating technology, I would say don't be seduced by too many different ways to do something, right? There's many different answers to one question. This isn't engineering. This is more of a design thing, right? You have many different solutions to one problem, but it's so hard to stay focused. I know if you come to our facility, you'll find that even though I'm saying this, there's tons of ways to do stuff there. And that's the balance I'm trying to find between this stakeholder pressure and what the audience can bear when they come. When I try to tell my the people that I work for, whoever they may be, other stakeholders, they can have two of three things. You can have something good, fast, or cheap. You can have two of those three, but you can't have all three, right? It can be good and fast, but it's not going to be cheap. Or it can be good and cheap, but it's not going to be fast, right? You're two of the three. And so let technology sort of help you get there as opposed to being overwhelmed by the amazing potential of that it has, and it always will.
Really good points. And actually, I think what I'm hearing is educating our stakeholders to know what they're looking at to be able to evaluate the success of a specific project. Now, I realize, Jesse, at National Music Center, I neglected to get to you on the question of where do you recommend organizations begin when they're planning to include immersive or interactive technology. So Jesse, do you want to take a gander at that? Thank you.
Sure, we could take a few steps back. And I was just about to say that it's exciting being the fourth person because I agree with all of my colleagues in their steps about planning to include immersive or interactive technology in the organization's daily activities. But first, I always strongly suggest organizations start by focusing on what they do best. I think this sounds a little bit of an oversimplification, but in a world where there's all forms of technology and it's dominant, I often see organizations trying to be something that they're not, trying to follow trends. And I think that we've mentioned that as well. So start by focusing on what you do best, possibly something that only you can do. Then define your big idea. I think Milan said is the so what. So define that big idea. What do you want people to feel? What do you want people to experience, to walk away thinking? Second, determine what type of immersive or interactive technology you think makes most sense to engage your audience. You would know best. So are you designing for kids, adults? Is this for everybody? Do you want to create a passive or a participatory engagement through the technology? Is it an online experience versus a brick and mortar experience? Are you thinking augmented reality, AR, or simply just an interactive kiosk? Third, as boring as this sounds, determining what you can afford, or better yet, how much you're willing to pay for that experience. We talked a lot about if you got a grant, but I'm taking a few steps back. And so Immersive and interactive technology has its benefits, but it's costly. It requires maintenance. It can become outdated very quickly. So when you're working on those budgets, be careful for considering things like annual maintenance costs, longevity of the chosen technology. Can you update the technology, and eventually you'll have to replace it. For budget purposes, we typically plan for a 10-year life cycle, but practically speaking, I think you're closer to 5 years is a little bit more realistic before something becomes outdated. So once your whole team, the internal team, is all aligned with all these steps, now engage your third-party consultants, the experts that can bring these ideas to fruition. I find lessons learned. I think we've all had those experiences. I find that time and money can be wasted if you don't have a good sense of what you want to do before engaging your consultants. Otherwise, you just spend a lot of time in that discovery, slinging spaghetti at the walls, just throwing out ideas. And as a not-for-profit, it's just it's sometimes an unnecessary expense.
That's a really important idea, that there's something that each organization uniquely holds that they're really good at, and how important that is to have those conversations about how technology is used to further enhance that and put those messages ahead. Jesse, I've had many visits, enjoyed your National Music Center many times, and have seen, from the time you opened. How long is it now? Is it 2 years?
It's our 5-year anniversary. We
No.
we opened Canada Day in 2016.
Wow.
And it's 5 years now. So we're excited to celebrate that milestone, albeit it is COVID and we're in the middle of a pandemic, and we're currently, like all other cultural institutions in Alberta, are shut down. But we're excited this year to celebrate those milestones.
And so 5 years, it just seems amazing to me that that's possible, but I guess it is, because you would know. So 5 years, you're now at that life cycle probably for some of your exhibits. And I wonder, looking back, are there some experiences that you've been able to provide that you felt were significantly more successful than others? And I wonder why.
That's a really multifaceted question. So for those of you that aren't familiar with the National Music Center, we morphed from a grassroots organization, and we thought immersive technology was really just lighting and paint, and then moved into this more nationally focused organization. It's a 160,000 square foot facility, and we spent 3 years. So I guess the lesson is we spent 3 years in the development phase, building out this 22 exhibition spaces. So that's 3 years. So you add those 3 years to the life cycle because you've spec'd equipment that was current 3 years before you actually opened, or in some cases you could develop it in 2 years or 1 year, whatever that is. So when you say we're 5 years in, I'm thinking we're 8 years in to a 10-year life cycle span. So that was food for thought, and we were fortunate to have worked with Haley Sharp Designs, which is an amazing company that works all over the world and has developed some amazing experiences. Budget plays a big part in it. So much so that you have all these grandiose ideas, but when it comes down to it, sometimes what you think you're getting is not necessarily what you get. So that would be the number one takeaway from opening this new facility, creating all those new exhibitions or experiences from scratch, that we had really big ambitions, and we thought that our budget was quite fulsome for those exhibitions, and they are great. However, you never have enough when it comes to technology.
Technology seems like this big gobbling giant, actually. But anyway, this is helping to demystify. Thank you, Jesse. So I'm going to return to the question about the piece of advice, and we already heard from Milan. So let's move on to Amanda for that. So Amanda, if you could provide one piece of advice about integrating technology of any kind in a nonprofit organization, what would it be?
Yeah, I think Jesse's answer for the previous question actually dovetails really nicely in what my piece of advice would be, which is to think really hard about how you're going to support this, especially after the initial excitement has maybe faded. So there's hidden costs when you are incorporating technology. There's stress on staff, even staff who are just adjacent to it, maybe aren't quite sure what to make of it or are expected to provide some support in some way. You have to really think about that when you are planning to incorporate any piece of exciting new technology. And I think with nonprofits especially, and those that are maybe smaller, there's tendency to, there's a can-do attitude, right? We can do anything. We can do it on a shoestring. We can do it ourselves. But that can be really hard when you're integrating technology that needs that sort of full support, long-term, all of the time, whether you are purchasing that, there's costs up front, then you can put some of that support onto an outside party, or if you're doing it yourself, you have to sort of commit to that or else it gathers dust in a year. So really, really considering that before you take too many steps too far is really important.
That's great advice. I guess there can be a tendency to think of technology as once it's in, you push a button and it goes. Just like you turn the Roomba on and it does the vacuuming while you're not there. So thinking always about the impact on the staff that has to work with it and the training and ongoing support of, and probably, I guess, the people that you've purchased any of these tech devices from, knowing ahead and having confidence that they'll be there to support as that 5 or 10 year cycle goes along. Okay, so same question then over to Dan. If you could provide one piece of advice about integrating technology of any kind in a nonprofit organization, what would it be?
Yeah, this is actually great. We're all building off of one another's answers. So those long-term costs, thinking about how it's going to impact people that Amanda and Jesse kind of mentioned. I think another thing to think about is how hard your customers, your visitors will be on that exhibit. There's the saying of things that are museum grade or library grade, and they need to be built to withstand like anything that you can imagine that somebody might do with that exhibit. They're going to go one step further. Somebody's going to find out how to break that exhibit. And I mean, most recently I can think of here at the library, we have a gaming room. So that's it's just under 2,000 square foot room dedicated to video gaming. We got computers, game systems, and we had some really cool arcade cabinets. And you think there's arcades all around the world and people playing them all the time. But the ones that we picked had some buttons on it that were like a clear acrylic. They looked really cool because the lights could shine through them, but they weren't a good commercial grade. And somebody came in, I believe, with a bunch of rings on their hands and was playing this arcade. And sure enough, this arcade cabinet has cracked buttons on it now. And we're having to fix it and get it replaced with something different. So something that was an oversight at the start, and there's always going to be an oversight, but planning for that long term, those hidden costs, making sure that it is of a high quality and can withstand the punishment that the public will give it is something to keep in mind.
And I guess to some extent, you're knowing about the high quality of someone ties back to the suppliers that you've got a relationship with and over time have confidence in. And
yeah, and I think even if you're able to learn the lessons from other organizations that have messed up too. So before you go out and buy something, do a scan, call some people, even call the organization that you're looking to buy from and ask them if there's other institutions that have purchased said product. Get a hold of them and see how it's working. I know I've received lots of calls like that about many different things. So, and I'm always happy to provide that feedback to somebody so they don't have to go through the same mistakes or successes. I shouldn't say it's not all bad.
Great, thank you, Dan. And so Jesse, I'm going to pop back to you now with that, the advice question. If you could provide one piece of advice about integrating technology of any kind in a nonprofit organization, what would it be? I think you've already started speaking to that question. Do you have anything that you want to add to that?
Well, I'd like to add just a memory that I have by Dan bringing up the durability aspect. I think it's a critical role. And when working with Haley Sharp, they shared a story with us that they were working with a large US museum, and their director of exhibitions. They would bring in an immersive screen or any type of screen. They'd bring it in, he would put it on the floor, kick it. And if his foot penetrated, then it was like, no, we're moving on to the next piece of hardware, because it is amazing that I know that people aren't intentional, or at least we hope that they're not intentional, but really there's a lot of abuse that happens with any of these technologies. So as a not-for-profit and with a modest operational budget, there's the consideration of the if you're starting from scratch, something new, there's the capital expenses that go into that, creating those experiences. And then there's the day-to-day operations to keep those experiences relevant and meaningful and current. So over the last 5 years, I think our internal team has created 20 new physical exhibitions. And then because of the pandemic, created one online exhibition this past June. So to create these physical and interactive experiences, the group, we were all kind of joking around with it because we all use it. It's a go-to piece of technology that is, I would say, is relatively inexpensive, has great support and training opportunities. And the technology is a content management and publishing tool that allows you to create your own interactives. So it's a tool that you've all probably used, but you just didn't know it. And it allows us to create access points through either a screen or a touch table or buttons. Basically, it controls screens, projectors, audio, every piece of hardware within your facility or your type of interactive exhibition. And I think at this point, I kind of feel like I should read a disclaimer before I share this piece of technology, simply because I just want to make sure that everybody understands that National Music Center is not endorsing it. However, we've had great success with it. So the piece of technology is called a Bright Sign Player. And it's just brightsign.biz, and I highly recommend you check it out. Bright Sign is much more than a media player. It will allow you to create interactive experiences for a few $1,000s versus tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars if you have someone else develop it for you. And a few additional tips would also include, and I think some of our colleagues here mentioned them, is stay away from developing your own custom software and always buy technology off the shelf from proven vendors. There's nothing worse than having to invest in investing in custom software. I can speak from experience. Then have a developer no longer support that technology, and then have someone else rewrite the software so that it continues to function. And it's a very, and so on and so forth. And it's a very expensive lesson to learn.
Can you show us your Bright Sign Player?
Can I? Of course.
Uh-huh.
It's just this little piece of hardware. It does amazing things. And I think Milan's organization uses it. Dan talked about Raspberry Pi, which is another device. But Bright Sign and Bright Sign Author, they have training. So their staff are more than willing to kind of guide you through building your own interactive experiences.
Milan, did you want to comment about that at all? Your experiences with that? With Bright Sign?
I'm muted, sorry. Sorry
Okay.
about that. I have a 2-level mute, my regular mute and my microphone mute, so I have to keep them both in mind. I'm gonna make t-shirts, I think, after this that says you are on mute. So that, because everybody has that at least once in a meeting. Anyway, yeah, just brought up some great points. We do use the Bright Sign in a great number of experiences in our facility, both as an information delivery methodology for marketing, televisions, wayfinding screens, but also as an input-output device, by which I mean it can react to button inputs or other kinds of input and direct a certain outcome. So We use it in a few exhibits, and it's very reliable, solid state. I also have no stake in it. If you buy one and experience something negative, I apologize. We never have one break or fail. We have them in remote locations as well, because we're confident in them staying operational, and they're quite wonderful, and they really revolutionize what we do. And we used to have all kinds of DMX controls and DVD players with different tracks and stuff, and it was just a nightmare to keep things going. So Bright Signs is one of the technologies that really has helped us make things much smaller, much more compact, and much easier to operate.
Cool. Thank you, Milan. And actually, I'm going to move on to our next question, and I'm going to ask Amanda to respond to it first. We are gathering actually some really interesting questions as we're going along, so I know our question and answer period with the whole group is going to be great. So Amanda, do you see immersive and interactive technology becoming more prevalent considering the recent jump towards digital technology?
I mean, yes. I feel like that's the short answer. Yes, I do. But I feel like the caveat there, going back to everything everyone else has said, is I feel like we're in a place of growing pains right now where the hardware is affordable, and maybe the experiences that you're creating are less affordable. So you have to think about those two pieces. You know, again, you have the technology, you bought it off the shelf, you could afford it, you were able to put it into your organization. It's great. Immersive and interactive technology for everyone. But that second piece, again, what are you doing with it, is, I think, a question that we really have to wrestle with.
Yeah. Jesse, could you respond to that? Do you see immersive and interactive technology becoming more prevalent considering the recent jump towards digital technology?
Without question, I think there's no doubt that we're seeing an increase in organizations wanting to accelerate their, in particular, online presence, particularly since we've been impacted by the pandemic. COVID-19 definitely made NMC pivot to online content creation because we needed to reach audiences well beyond our bricks and mortar. Digital acceleration has always been a priority for our organization, but our approach probably would have been more gradual if it had not been for the pandemic. I'm going to lean on the pandemic quite a bit because I think we've had some time to reflect on it. Building closures, restrictions surrounding the reduced number of touch points, as outlined by the province and Alberta Health Services, really had me questioning the use of, or the future use of, interactive technology within our exhibitions. To give you a size of scope, it's 65 interactive touchscreens, probably 12 projectors. We have musical instrument interactives where guests are invited to sit down and play instruments that is coached by headphones and a kiosk that is really a lesson. Vocal isolation booths where visitors were often encouraged to go in there and sing their hearts out. We had music mixing stations and a children's makerspace. So all of which are highly interactive and engaging. All are currently, because of COVID, deactivated. We've either removed them or temporarily reprogrammed them to more of a passive engagement slideshow or as prompts for proper physical distancing measurements. So pre-COVID, our visitor feedback really told us visitor satisfaction was highest in galleries that had digital interactivity or anything visitors could actively engage with. And this was also true over galleries that solely focused on a singular immersive type experience. So within our exhibitions, interactivity had been a critical condition to a positive visitor experience. Aside from, if you've seen our building, it's quite an interesting and stunning architecture. So visitors wanted to have that interactivity, or they wanted to experience the building in of itself. So now that we're nearly 1 year into the pandemic and we see the light at the end of the tunnel, I'm not so much questioning the use of our digital interactives within our exhibitions, because I think these restrictions will pass. We'll get through this. And when we do, the ability to get out there and physically engage and touch things again will likely be embraced more than ever, at least for the short term.
Great. Thank you, Jesse. And same question over to Dan. Do you see immersive and interactive technology becoming more prevalent considering the recent jump towards digital technology?
Yeah. Jesse, I sure hope people are more excited to come back and push buttons and sing and play. One thing we haven't talked about a bunch here is the library is kind of in the same boat. We have 3 recording studios and 1 video studio that are part of our makerspace that we've been operating in a very limited capacity when we were opened, and we do want to invite people in to come, sing their hearts out and get their hands on all those instruments that we have. But it's tough. But in terms of immersive and interactive technology becoming more prevalent, yeah, absolutely. But I think, and it comes back to that why. Why are you using it? What's the point you're trying to make? What's the thing you want your customers to experience? The technology is the conduit for the point you're trying to make or the experience you're trying to deliver, and it can make it better too. But I think it just needs to be intentional. And I also wanted to take this moment. I know in the poll at the start there was a big discussion, or a few people voting on wanting to know more about VR. And we do have some VR headsets here at the library, and we've had them in the past. And I've done a little bit of research a few years ago on putting VR into facilities. And this is, the putting on the goggles and experiencing something in 3D. It's really cool as an individual experience. But I guess a word of caution is that, let's say you bring your family to a facility and you're lining up to go in VR, you all put your goggles on, instantly there's a barrier between yourself and your family or your friends or whoever you're visiting with. So that collaborative group experience where you're laughing and looking at the expression on one another's faces is gone, and it's replaced by this headset. So while it's really novel and it's really cool and it makes some people sick, and there's things you can do in it that are really fun, especially if you combine them with moving chairs or objects that you can sit on, it does take away a little bit of that collaborative experience that you might get. So yes, technology is going to become more prevalent, but I think that we need to figure out the best ways to use it still. I think there's still a lot of lessons to learn, and I think Amanda touched on it too, that it's accessible, but we haven't figured out the best ways to use it all yet, which is why we're talking today. So
Great, thank you. And Milan, anything to add to that, whether it's going to...
I can't hear you. I've got a webinar going. Yes? We have to be there at 12:30.
Can everybody please mute? Thank you. So Milan, is it going to become more prevalent?
No, I'm just kidding. Absolutely, well, as our other panelists have said, and I'm sure most of you have experienced, I'm just want to loop back to a couple of things that have been said just recently. Dan mentioned COVID impacts, as has Jesse, and for a place like Telescope of Science, you can probably imagine that it's been a bit devastating for us, and so we've had to leverage the tech to go online for remote experiences, and our in-house team of educators and scientists are just amazing. They're so resourceful. My team helps whenever we can, but this is certainly a phase where they're shining a lot brighter, than they had a chance to before, and we love to support that. We find that we can reach a broader audience around the world, and this is mostly, in part, it's mostly to do with the fact that we've been doing this for a long time, just in-house, and now that we have to go beyond our walls, tech is helping us do that. Dan mentioned VR limitations, and I'm going to echo that I mentioned earlier, and I don't want to be pessimistic. VR is wonderful, as you said, but it does come at a cost, financial and also experiential, if it's not incorporated properly. For us, the things Jesse mentioned about operational considerations are a big factor for us. So hygiene, even before pandemic, hygiene between users, durability of the headsets. The more tech they are, the more fragile they tend to be. And so the issue we're facing, I believe, is that as the tech evolves, it's a moving target for us, right? We try to get the best experience, the most experience, but that keeps changing. It gets smaller, faster, better, more immersive potentially. And when we have demonstrations from vendors, we see it can do this, it can do that, it can do this. And we're like, well, that's amazing. Augmented reality is another amazing technology that is being used to educate people and being used to help connect from around the world. But it's that focus on the message, the brand of what you do as an organization or what you do as an individual even, that'll keep, I hope, driving the technology. And so it's more prevalent. It has to be. It's everywhere. It's in our pockets. It's in our health systems. It's in our vehicles, our modes of transport. It's everywhere. And so there's also a question of the visibility of the technology as well as the prevalence. So we focus at our science center, at least in my department, and whenever we develop exhibits, to stay just beyond the leading edge, because for us, it can also be the bleeding edge. And what I mean by that is the operational limitations, keeping things supported, keeping things running. If an experience or an interaction leverages technology too heavily, and the technology happens to be fallible, then the immersive element is completely lost, and the whole experience is gone. And I used to get emails periodically about nothing in the Science Center works, everything is broken. And I would say to people, we have almost 400 exhibits. I think it's probably unlikely. But that doesn't matter, right? That math doesn't matter. If their feeling is that everything is broken, they must have been let down by whatever they're looking forward to the most. And so developing things in a sort of somewhat patient, somewhat focused way allows us to make sure those things work and they have multiple avenues of backup that'll help the experience get across, and then people will be enhanced as opposed to disappointed. People talked about how hard visitors can be on stuff, and I think of that as being enthusiasm. They come to our facility and they're so excited to interact with things, and they will be again. I believe that to be the case. We, on a good year, we have 500,000 people at our facility. On some of our solid years, like we had Harry Potter and such exhibits like this, and that's a huge audience. If you even think that 0.5% of that, that's 6 people a day who come just to break stuff. And so, yeah, we kick things, we throw golf balls at things, we throw car keys at things, we have our offsite shop where we just torture exhibits. And yet still people are ingenious and enthusiastic. And so we have to react to this. And I see them as opportunities for us to look for different ways to improve the design. If someone breaks something, it isn't always because of malicious intent. It can be because they just didn't know what to do. And so the prevalence is certainly a big factor. And I think I try to kind of pump the brakes a bit when it comes to incorporating new tech whenever possible, but with the message of not just being conservative, but with being on point, on brand, if you will, whatever you want, whatever technical term you want to use, but to keep our message clear and let that drive the experience. So technology prevalence certainly there, but I think it should not come at the cost of a prevalence of storytelling or a prevalence of content delivery.
Great, thank you, Milan. So the next question, and I'm going to start off with Jesse on this one. How do you go about considering the visibility of the technology within immersive and interactive exhibit experiences?
This this will be a short answer. But when it comes to considering how visible the technology is within our exhibitions, I wouldn't go to great lengths to hide the technology unless it negatively impacted the visitor's experience. So this is where good design plays a critical role. The technology needs to be designed in a way that is intuitive, it's easy to use, and yields an outcome for the visitor. But we don't typically go to any great lengths to try to hide stuff.
Okay. Amanda, what are your thoughts on the visibility of the technology within exhibit experiences?
For us, I think this is the great advantage of the public library. If the library is Oz, we want to invite you back behind the curtain. We want you to see what's going on there. So even with the wall, where we want it to be an immersive, seamless experience, we don't want things to be broken when you come visit. We want things to be good. You can't see the servers and the graphic cards and the networking cables. That's all hidden behind there. But we still have a Tuesday morning maintenance window where you see applications in development. You might see someone pop open the back and go inside. And if someone asks, we're happy to tell you all about what's going on with the technology behind that curtain. There's a very strong DIY movement that's connected to libraries. We have maker spaces. So we want to invite you in and show you the technology and not disrupt your immersive experience, but if possible, invite you to accept that technology into the immersive experience, into your learning experience. So we want you to put your hands in it and figure out how it works. So our public library advantage is there can be that DIY element to it without breaking the experience.
Cool. So you invite it and you want that curiosity.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Dan, what are your thoughts about the visibility of the technology within the immersive and interactive exhibit experience?
Yeah, within our context, Amanda nailed it. Like we want to educate, well, I shouldn't say that. We want to give people the option to know how it works and the forum to ask, hey, this thing's really cool. How is it doing that? So that's kind of the ethos of the makerspace as well. I think that's really important. However, if your institution's goal is to have a truly immersive space or room or gallery or something like that, I think the technology should be a mystery if that's your goal. If you want people to be transported to the 1800s but you're using digital technology somewhere in there to showcase what was going on at the time, whether it be like screens or augmented reality or virtual reality or some sort of devices. I think the more technology is a mystery and the less you see it, the more immersed you are in that scene, if that's your goal. Again, that's kind of the Disney theme park model. If you go stand in line for some of those rides, you wouldn't even know that there's things moving on the wall and you can't see cables running anywhere. So there's benefits to both. I think Amanda hit it on the head, though, that our stance is we want you to know how it works, and we're glad to sit down with you and have a chat about it.
Thank you. Milan, I know you talked a little bit already about the visibility aspect. Do you have anything that you want to add to this question before we move on to open question and answers from our participants?
Sure, yeah, thank you. I mean, it is, as Amanda and Dan have said, there are times when it's appropriate to show the tech, and we have galleries in our facility that are certainly themed in this manner. That that is the point of the inclusion of technology. There is to show people how it works. Open up the guts and make see-through cabinets for things, and see levers and buttons, and play with circuits and see how things work. And that's a really wonderful energy that we have in our facility in a couple of galleries. Other galleries we have are a little bit less focused on that, and as Dan alluded to, there's times when it's not appropriate for it to be visible. And for me, also, that means beyond the literal visible. Technology gets smaller, it gets more compact, and therefore you can hide it easier. And it's wireless and so on in a lot of examples. But also, visibility can also mean the speed of the interaction, right? If you rely on technology to help something unfold, and if the tech isn't up to the task, whether it's due to communication issues with your network or due to processing speed, then the tech becomes visible because there's a lag in the experience. And so it isn't like a literal physical visibility, which is an important thing to consider. It's also the speed of the interaction, the ease of the interaction that can control visibility. Yeah, actually, you know what? That might be enough about that. Don't let it become a barrier, is what I'm getting at, visibility or lack thereof. I don't want to go on too long. We have great guests to hear from.
Great. Okay, thanks, Milan. So here's a question that's come in for the panel. And okay, at this point, audience, we're now asking questions from you. And these are questions that the participants haven't had ahead of time to prepare for. So this question, how do you evaluate how successful your immersive and interactive technology is? How do you evaluate how successful your immersive and interactive technology is?
It's an excellent question. I'll just start on that because evaluation is a big part of what we try to do. We don't have a formal evaluation body at our facility, but we have staff members that are experienced in evaluation processes. And there's a great deal of work done by Science North out of Sudbury on evaluating experiences. And I would look into a lot of their work is available publicly. They've done some amazing work when it comes to evaluation. I was at a facility pre-pandemic, certainly in the US, doing some research on the health galleries. I think it was in Minneapolis. anyway, it's a humongous science center there, just massive. And in the US, they tend to combine science centers and museums together into science museums. In Canada, we tend to separate those two for whatever reason. But anyway, they had an exhibit team of 100 people. I have 4 people at our facility. They had 100 people in their facility. It was about twice the size of ours. But among that, they had a 10-person evaluation team, and whose sole job it was to be on the floor, asking questions, very carefully worded questions, before an experience, during and after the experience, to see what visitors' takeaway was. And so we adopted some of that methodology in a very small scale. And really it's asking, what the takeaways are. Like, what did you get from this experience? What did you expect to get? And what did you get? And then we can see if we can fill that gap.
Any other thoughts on that question? How you evaluate your success from the rest of the panel?
I will pipe in and just, Milan alluded to the work that Science North did, and it was actually Chantal Barrio with Laurentian University wrote an article about assessing exhibits. We did some research, and it's really well done. And it includes a tool that you can use and modify for your own use, but it does a really great job at describing a user's behavior and defining what success at an exhibit might look like. So I think that's what you would do to assess your exhibit. Define what success looks like. What does a successful experience mean to your customers? And then can you observe them doing that? And can you observe any barriers that might inhibit them from getting to that space? So, I mean, I'm distilling that very, very quickly, but that's the bones of it for sure.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask a question for Jesse from Graham, and this is music related. Graham says, I have edited some virtual orchestra and choir projects since the pandemic restrictions began. Are there any tech or design suggestions for making these virtual productions more immersive or engaging to the audiences and/or participants?
Wow, that's a really good question. I think that's something that we're all challenged with. I think at a time where streaming concerts, like, boy, have you seen more concerts now than you ever have in your entire life from artists at home just doing it via Zoom or some higher production. Our recommendation, we were streaming 3 concerts before we got shut down this past December. We were streaming up to 3 concerts per week. And I would say that production value plays a component, but if you're trying to get more engagement, I think these chats, so the audience, so I think there's 2 ways to do it. There's live streaming or there's capture and release. I think with live streaming, you have an opportunity, although technically it stresses people out a lot more. There's a lot more that could go wrong and you can't edit. But when you live stream, it gives you the opportunity to have that direct engagement with the audience as you would with a real concert. So you have artists participating and perhaps people are making quick requests just like this chat line. I think that's one way to try to make that experience a little bit more engaged.
Thank you, Jesse. I'm actually going to ask Anne-Marie Switzer, my colleague from the WinSphere, if she might pop on. And I know, Anne-Marie Switzer, you have been monitoring some of the questions. Can you share what you have been able to identify as a next question for us?
Yes, thank you so much. This has been such fruitful conversation, and there are some questions that were sent directly to me with regards to earlier questions you were speaking to. Something I think Milan was maybe touching on a little bit, but if you wanted to expand, how do you determine the shelf life of immersive interactive technology? Like, everything happens so fast in the tech world. Do you want to have the latest, greatest thing, or is it better to stick with kind of tried and true?
So I'll address that first, maybe. We try to find a balance between those 2 things. We don't do the latest, greatest. As I mentioned, the bleeding edge is expensive, resource-wise, and And it's also stressful, right? I mean, there's always something new and fast and amazing coming out tomorrow or yesterday. So we try to stay, tried and true is also difficult, because then you can be seen as being sort of stagnant and resistant to change. And we don't want to be seen as such, certainly at a science center. And it's hard to, Jesse mentioned earlier, by the time we get something on the floor, it's been in planning for a while, and we might not have 3-year planning cycles, but we certainly have a year and a half. And so when you spec technology at that point, and by the time it comes into your user environment, it could be a year and a half old already, and something better has already come along. And so for us, the shelf life of something is determined really by the frequency of which it's deemed to be broken. Right. So the more often somebody says, "Oh, I tried this thing, it didn't work, or didn't do what I expected," and I think Dan saying that defining success is that's a hugely important thing. That an exhibit can't do everything, an experience can't have every facet, and that's okay. Right. You can tell the same story with multiple different technologies, but defining what success means is so important. And so I would say the shelf life really would be when the thing can no longer support that definition of success. Right? If the object, the technology, maybe it's physical, maybe it's tech, it no longer supports what you define as success, then you have to find a different way.
That's so true. I'm not sure if anybody else wanted to speak to that or not. Feel free to jump in. But thank you for that, Milan. I also had a question we have here from William in the chat, that he comments that he's noticed the public institutions have a good handle on the hardware, but the software is what will take the hit because of the budget. And so could perhaps someone speak to maybe they have experience with making inroads in the collaboration of experts in like video game companies or people who have that expertise? I'm not sure if anybody's done those collaborations or not.
Amanda did mention earlier about the collaboration with the post-secondary institutions. But I think you can. It just depends on the partnerships that you can make, and if there's something that can be a mutually beneficial partnership that can work with. Perhaps the technology is something that, in the case of the touch table, Amanda's been working really well with post-secondary institutions at Edmonton to treat it, kind of shift the focus of that exhibit to be a test bed. And it's really cool. And in thinking of, you've got a really great technology, maybe the software is not working quite right. Maybe there's a way that you can put a spin on it where it's beneficial for that organization in your community to help out, whether they get recognition somewhere. You can work on events together or support them and their initiatives in some way to get some sort of cross promotion or mutually beneficial relationship. If managing your budget becomes an issue, that's what I would recommend, and just be honest with some folks about it too. Say, hey, we're struggling a little bit. Would you be willing to help out your local nonprofit? And you'd be surprised how well that works sometimes. So that would be my advice.
Thanks, Dan. I'm noticing from Pamela, she would like to hear what people are thinking for the integration of tech in programming for generations growing up with the expectation of technology-involved experience. So the integration of tech in programming for generations growing up with the expectation of technology-involved experience.
Yeah, that's a great question, and really, for us, we find that sort of a self-governing thing, where as our audience grows, they began their journey in their learning journey with technology as part of that. So we find, I remember there was a moment for me, probably in 2010, 2011, when we were about to open a new children's gallery. This is the previous generation of children's gallery, and I was walking through doing some checks, and I saw a dad with his toddler on his lap. And he was, dad was looking at the exhibit that was in front of him, and the toddler just grabbed the mouse and began to move it around. And I was like, holy, like it surprised me that there's a digital, not a digital immigrant like myself, but that was part of that person's journey right from the start. And so in a way that happens without us doing anything about it. So we have to include that audience, because we know that that's how they learn. And we're finding now that everyone expects everything to be a touch screen, right? Every screen's a touch screen, even if it's not a touch screen. And we have an exhibit now that we're going to open hopefully before October on dinosaurs, and it has an element with you take a piece and you put it on part of the exhibit and something happens on the screen, but you don't put the piece on the screen, you put it on the exhibit cabinet. But on the screen you can see wear marks from the previous installation where people have been putting the object on the screen directly. They expect everything to be a touch screen, and so that's okay, but we have to know this going in, and protect screens, and if it's not supposed to be a touch screen, make it really, really obvious that this is not what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to do something else. And that's going to become harder and harder as touchscreens go into vehicles, and they go into obviously in your pockets. And so we, in a way, to answer this question, I think it's sort of self-governs, because we don't have a choice, for us anyway.
Any other thoughts on that before we move on to our final question? Okay, the final question for everybody is, which exhibit or technology have you found works best and why? That's almost asking you to choose your favorite child, but anyway. Which exhibit or technology have you found works best and why?
I'll jump in. I'll jump in on this one. I think that, and it is like asking who your favorite child is. But I think that, we manage 22 different experiences. And I think that the favorite experience is one that integrates as many of the technologies and non-technologies as possible. So most recently we're the home for 4 Canadian Music Halls of Fame. And we wanted to create an environment where people felt like they were going to the Canadian Music Awards, which is the Junos. So you enter the space using red carpet, and you've got just, the old school velvet ropes that guides you into that experience. And then you have a series of projectors and audio, and you've created this environment that is everything from reading a didactic panel to graphics on a wall, to flashing videos, to pull quotes that are digitally. So I think you've got objects. I think it's a combination of everything, because we've talked about this a lot, it's different access points for all visitors. And it's tough to hit all those every single time. And so in our experience to date, it's not necessarily the best technology or the worst, somewhere in between, but then you're also merging technologies with, if I use this, like analog, real things that you can touch, furniture, fixtures. You'd be amazed at when people just walk in and they see the red carpet, they're like, oh my God, I got to step on that. It's just red carpet.
Thanks, Jesse. Who's next?
It's definitely picking your favorite child. I mean, we have, I mentioned in our facility, 40,000-ish square feet of interactive spaces, and within which there's 300 something exhibits. And I don't know if I can, excuse the hammering, there's some construction happening. I don't know if I can pick a favorite. I think we, in 2018, opened up a new space gallery within which we have what's called an object theater, which is a theater presentation that has objects in it. Seems obvious, but as the story unfolds, those things are highlighted with lights and sequences and projectors and so on. And I think that's done a really good job to take people into the story of, why we have our moon rock. That's what it was about. We have a piece of the moon at the signs, and it's pretty amazing, but it's small. And to make it more important, you can't make the moon rock any bigger, right? We can't put it into a bigger case. It looks even smaller. And so we use the tech to tell the story of the moon rock, thereby making the importance of that object more emotional to people. If they can appreciate the investment of resources and sacrifice and technology that had to happen over the decades for this to be within their presence, it helps really to make it feel special. So the environment certainly is somewhat immersive, but it's not like you're on the moon. We didn't go that route. We felt that would be a bit too sort of, well, I guess cheesy would be the right word. You know, we could have tried, but I don't think we would have gotten there. And so we chose instead to tell the story of the object and really immerse people that way. So for me, I think that's, the tech there is not invisible. You can see the projections, you can see the lights doing their thing, and there's LEDs and all kinds of stuff, but it's not the takeaway. You know, when you leave that space, you hopefully leave with the message of that thing's amazing. Like, it took a lot of human effort to get this thing here in front of me. And so for me, it's one of my favorite elements. But again, it's like picking children. There's a great many examples in there.
Thanks, Milan. How about you, Amanda? What technology or exhibit has worked best for you and why?
That's a tough one. We don't have the same wide selection as some of my colleagues here. And I feel like the exhibits that have worked best for our customers are not necessarily the ones that have been the easiest for us to take care of or maintain. So for example, we have an augmented reality sandbox at one of our branches, and it's intended for children, and they love it. If the branch is open and it's on, they make a beeline for it. But it is, I mean, it's a box full of sand with a projector over top, and a Kinect camera to measure the depth of the sand. And then there's a program that runs on the computer that changes the landscape as they move the sand around. So it's very popular. They love it. But you know, they come and they throw the sand in the air and it gets inside of the projector, and they throw it on the floor, and then the floor is slippery. You have to go and pop open the head and clean out the projector every 6 months because it's full of sand, and that's dangerous, and the bulbs burn out. And so what's a very simple walk up and use experience for the customer is like a nightmare to clean and deal with behind the scenes, but you know, they love it. So you put in that effort. So unfortunately, sometimes the favorite or the easy customer experience is exactly the opposite for the person maintaining it or behind the scenes.
That sounds like a familiar thing. Sometimes the things that are the biggest hits are the hardest to deliver. And there's always that groan, here we go again. But if we are all in service to the people who come through our doors, then I hope we lean to the hard things when they are the best things. Okay, I think, Dan, I haven't heard from you yet on this. Who's your favorite child?
So I won't pick a favorite child today, but what I will do is I'll pull a string together from everybody's examples, are that they're non-trivial. So when a customer walks up or a guest walks up, they're just doing it. They're not asking, okay, how does this work? You know, in Jesse's example, they're walking it, they're there, and they're experiencing it. The object theater at the Space Gallery is amazing. You walk in, you sit down, you enjoy the show, like you know what you need to do when you get in there. Same thing, the sand table, get in there and chuck some sand around and see what happens. It's not complex. You don't have to think too hard to achieve success. And I think putting that into your design is really helpful too. And just thinking really quickly about an example with the next interactive that we're working on with the wall, some of our developers here had a really good thought where we've got these big flat touch screens. Maybe it's not wise for you to put an object on there that would appear for you to like slide forward into the screen. Everything needs to work on that plane. So spinning a dial might work, pushing a button might work, but sliding a lever, that might not work in the same way. So designing your exhibit so it's just easy, so nobody's punching things or wondering what's going wrong or breaking them in the end. I think that's my favorite.
Great answer. Thank you all for your answers to that question. I'm struck by that the accessibility, but also that you each spoke to an aspect of how the user gets drawn in and touched on an emotional level. So thank you all for participating today. It has been wonderful to have your expertise here. And I know that those of us who are fortunate enough to be in Alberta and can get out to these organizations and experience some of the things that our panelists have talked about today. We're really, as I said, very fortunate. So I would like to invite everybody to join us next Wednesday, February 24th, starting at 10 a.m. It will be Expanding Our Horizons, Innovation, Transformation, and the Future with presenter Annette Mees, who is the head of Audience Labs, the Royal Opera House in London, England. As a reminder, the registration is free. However, we would ask that you consider a donation, and a link to our registration page and donation page have both been placed in chat for you for easy access. By the end of this week, you will receive an email with notes from this event, and the email will also include a brief evaluation survey link. That link is also in our chat, so please do fill that out, give us your input and feedback. It helps us in our planning. Stay safe, everybody, and stay warm, and we look forward to welcoming you again next week. Thank you.